Hi again. So in this clip, we'll go through the initial setup of the network we need before we can start deploying PPDM and DDVE within AWS. So we'll start off with just a quick overview of what we're going to do. We're going to go into AWS, create our VPC, and we'll set up the relevant network addressing. We'll create two subnets, a public subnet and a private subnet. Then we'll create our routing tables and associate those to the subnets. Create an internet gateway for the public subnet, otherwise our jump can't get out. Create key pairs, build our EC2 instances and associate them to the relevant subnets. Create the security groups where we can define our ingoing and outgoing rules. And that's the first part. Right, so we'll start off firstly with the VPC setup. I'll create this new VPC and then we'll set up the CIDR addressing as 11.11.00/26. That gives me a range of from 11.11.01 to 62 in terms of IP addresses. That's a 255.255.255.192 mask then. We'll set up two subnets. So I'm going to associate the first subnet to that VPC. I'll call this subnet public subnet, and I'll give it an address of 11.11.00/28. So that gives us 14 IP addresses, 1 to 14, with a 255.255.255.240 mask. And it's got a root table associated to that by default. And I'll create a second subnet. This one will be the private subnet, again associated to that VPC. And this will be 11.11.016/28. So that gives us IP addresses from 17 to 30 with a mask of 255.255.255.240. And that's our two subnets built. A public subnet and a private subnet. And this is, remember, based on the guidance or the best practice for deploying PPDM and DDVE. So now we'll create some root tables. There's already one that was created by default, so I'm going to rename that. There won't be any explicit associations as yet to any of the subnets, so you can see those are the subnets without any explicit associations to any routing tables. So let's just take that default one, call that public root table, and then I'll associate that routing table explicitly to the public subnet. And then I'll do the same for the private subnet. So I'll create a routing table this time. So this one will be private. Select my VPC again. And then explicitly associate that. Now we need to create an internet gateway and attach that to the VPC, and that's for my public subnet. Without this, there's no way my jump host, which will be connected to the public subnet, can get out to the internet if it goes on via any other network or routes via any other network. So we'll need to also add that internet gateway to the routing table for that public subnet, so that jump can get outside. So I'm just looking back in the VPC and at the resource map. So at the moment there's no connection to that internet gateway. So let's do that. We'll add a route. So for everything else, via that gateway we just built. And that's now part of the route table for the public subnets. We'll build some key pairs. So let's create a key pair for an instance we're going to build. I've just called that a new instance. I've got a bunch of key pairs there for the other EC2 instances I have running at the moment. And so we'll create a new instance or launch a new instance. I'll create a Linux instance, use Ubuntu. These are all the free tiers I'm setting up here. And I've selected the key pair we just built, and now the networking. So we need to make sure we select the correct VPC we just built, and then I can also select the correct subnet. So I'm going to put this in the public subnet. We can create the security group here as well, or we can build it later. I'll give that a security name. I mean, that's a default name, and I'll give it a different name. And there's a description as well, and I can on this screen set up some additional inbound rules. So for example, I've got one there for SSH, so I can SSH. I'll add one for ICMPs just as an example, so I can ping. And then that's our storage that's been configured by default, and that's really all we need here. And now I've launched that instance, so that'll build. That'll be fairly fast. It's a small Linux or Ubuntu VM. And you'll see here now the security group. I'm just going to rename it. The description on the right hand side, you can see that was built by that EC2 instance. And if I go into the properties of it, then we can see the rules. So you have the inbound and outbound rules, and those are the two rules I'd set up. I can add more if I want. And there's a list of all the rules for incoming and outgoing traffic. So now back to our VPC, and we should see connections for the public subnets right the way to that internet gateway we set up. And that means access for our jump host. So this part now, we're going to build some S3 storage, create an S3 bucket, and then we can assign that to our DDVE instance. So for the S3 configuration, it's fairly straightforward. We'll create a bucket, and that's really it. So back into the AWS console, and I'll create a bucket here. So this is my storage. I've got various security settings here. So for example, by default, block public access settings for this bucket. Otherwise, the public will have access, and it warns you about that. We'll leave that on. And then the server-side encryption, we'll leave that as well. And then I'll create that bucket. I need to give it a name. I can't use underscores there, so I need to change the name, and that's done. So I've got a name there. That's our S3 bucket example 3. And now we'll go to the security setup. So we'll create the IAM security, the policies and the roles that define what those objects can do to other objects, or those instances can do to those objects. So we'll firstly create some policies for the instances we're going to build, and that'll define the permissions then. And then we'll also create some roles and assign those policies to those roles. And we also need to create an endpoint because of the network setup in terms of DDVE and PPDM are sitting within that private subnet and they're completely isolated. We need to somehow give DDVE access to that S3 bucket. So let's create a policy first. I'll create an example here. We can set up the permissions by JSON, or we can use these objects here, which automate the permission configuration, the script creation. What I'll do is I'm just going to go to the JSON option, and then that's the access I want to set up to my S3 bucket. And I'm creating this policy for DDVE. So I need to make sure that S3 bucket is the bucket I created. You can use wildcards if you just want to allow access to everything, but we want to make sure this is secure. And so let's put in our bucket name there that we just built. And then we'll give the policy a name. Right, and then what I'll do now, well, they can see the JSON that was built within the policy. So now I'll create a role. So for an AWS service is the trusted entity type and common use case for EC2. So I'm going to attach that role to the policy I built. And then I can assign that role to an instance. So you can see the role there. And just as an example, if I'll pick an instance here under security where I have the IAM role setting there, there's nothing assigned there, but I can go here and I can modify the role and assign that role, and that defines the permissions, whatever that instance can do to whatever other object within AWS. So I'll need that for DDVE later on. So now let's create the endpoint. This is how we define access from that private subnet where DDVE will sit to the S3 bucket. Otherwise, it can't see it. So I'm going to create an endpoint. And then it's a gateway. I need to select the correct VPC we're defining this for, and then also which subnet we're defining that for as well. So I could actually select the subnet in our last screen, or because I need to point this or associate this to my private subnet, or what I can also do is just do this through here, modify a route table. And so now there's a way from that private subnet to the S3 bucket for the DDVE instance that's going to sit in there when I build that later on. If we have a look at the VPC now and the resource map, then we should see all the connections. So that's my public subnet with the internet gateway set up, and then private subnet set up, and that also connects to the endpoint, which then goes to my S3 bucket. So that's our foundation, or our networking, all built based on that best practice. And from here, we're ready to deploy the instances. So as far as that instance that we built earlier goes, this is our Ubuntu instance sitting in our public subnet. It's got an internal address and also a publicly assigned IP address. And so I could connect to that from my laptop, or I could SSH into that. It's got a key pair assigned, so that's telling me the instructions of how to SSH and use that key pair to connect in to that instance. Here I've got a DDVE instance which I built earlier, so again you can see in terms of the networking, the subnet that's been built in, so that's the private subnet. And hopefully this makes more sense now that you've seen the network creation take place. PPDM also sits in that private subnet, and that's why I have a jump host which sits in the public subnet. That's my only way to access those instances or appliances. They're completely isolated, and that's the secure setup, or the best practice setup recommended for this. Right, let's just whiz through those diagrams again just to summarize. So we started off with an AWS console, built our VPC, created two subnets, so public subnet, private subnet, created the routing tables and associated those to the subnets, created an internet gateway for the jump, created some key pairs, built the instances, then set up our security, so created our security groups and what traffic can come in and out, then built our S3 bucket for DDVE, and then set up our IAM policies and roles. We created our policies here and then used JSONs, created the roles and associated those to the policies, built an endpoint which then connected to our S3 bucket, and that is it. Hope you enjoyed. Bye.